Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Security 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got myself, Brad, and Mr. Spencer here. We're here to talk about part two of the financial services cybersecurity challenges and how to address them. And so if you missed episode one, I highly recommend you go back and read that or listen to it. I guess you can't read it, right? And that'll give you some context.
You could, I guess. I mean, you could like have ChatGPT transcribe it, then write it on the screen and then read it.
Yeah, like, I'm guilty of that, by the way. I've had people send me YouTube videos that are like an hour and a half long, and I'm like, please summarize this in like 500 words or less, because I don't have time for that. So, but yeah, no, absolutely, man. So really in part one, we talked about our experience in the financial services space, because you and I both come from that background. And really we kind of talked about a lot of the challenges associated with just doing business in general, right? And so, let's talk today. I think that's what we're going to deep dive into, is really just regards to the threats that are associated with this particular market vertical, and just explain how all that stuff works, and maybe some ways to defeat it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking threats, attacks, or common attack paths, if you will, that financial service organizations are kind of faced with. So from a threat perspective, quote unquote, did you catch that?
Yes, so, that was well done, sir. Well done.
From a cyber threat perspective, which is the name of the show.
We have too much fun with this, man.
Right. I wanted to look at, as with all these podcasts, right? When we present information about threats or attacks or things like that, I like to base it on reality, right? I think it makes sense to like talk about things that are actually happening at these organizations and what we see in the wild. So I think threat reports are a great resource for that. And one of my favorites, if you've been listening for a while, you probably know, is the Verizon DBIR. That's a staple report of our industry. They come out with a new report every year. So in the 2025 Verizon DBIR, 74% of breaches were a result of a few things. One, system intrusion, social engineering, and basic web application attacks. So those three categories made up 74% of breaches, which I think is very interesting. And just for clarification of what system intrusion is,
I was going to ask. I'm glad you were ready for that.
System intrusion is kind of like a bucket, but it encapsulates all the breaches and incidents that leverage a diversity of techniques, predominantly hacking techniques and malware with a dash of social engineering. So they say, think of this pattern as a hands-on keyboard type of attack, in which they're using a combination of automation and craft to breach organizations' defenses and compromise their environment, largely with the purpose of deploying ransomware. So system intrusion is kind of like hands-on hacking techniques. Then we have social engineering, and then basic web application attacks. And that, again, that's 74% of breaches. Those are confirmed data breaches that were a part of the DBIR. So that right there, if you focus on nothing else, from a defensive standpoint, those are the three things that I look at that are big buckets of things that we need to protect against.
Yeah, and devil's advocate, by the way, the system intrusion does seem like a wide array of very generic phrases that, I would be curious to know, and it's probably in the report because I haven't looked at it in detail, but it seems like, okay, here's a whole big bucket of random stuff. And that now we're saying that it comprises 74%, which I'd be curious to know more about, like, all right, how many of that was web applications? How many of that had a social engineering aspect to it? Because my guess is a social engineering aspect to it is probably the largest definitive bucket. It's purely speculation, but I'm pretty sure that would be the case. And so I'd love to see more on the system intrusion and what all those little categories are. But to your point, these three things represent 3/4 of all breaches. And so, we need to talk about that for sure. I am not surprised to see the web applications on there. Dude, so I was doing a pen test for a financial organization. It was either earlier this year or late last year. It all kind of runs together after a while, but we were, during a web app pen test, able to move past the instance, like the tenant, if you will, and gain access to several other financial institutions' tenants. because of the implementation by the vendor. And so like it does not surprise me. And it doesn't surprise me, but it makes me sad.
Yep.
Because we've been doing web app security for 25 years. And it's just like, what are we doing, folks? Why are there still like, introspective enabled GraphQL? Why is that a thing?
Yeah, and you guys know when you do a web app pen test, or even on internal pen tests, what I see a lot of times is third-party applications that are hosted internally. Maybe they're not available to the internet, but they're available to all their employees and to their vendors and anybody else who needs to use it. Those many times have just as many web application flaws as things on the internet do.
Oh yeah, and in many cases more.
In many cases more. And what happens is, and what we see organizations missing that from an attack surface perspective, right? Because on an internal pen test, if you've got 3 or 4 web applications, we don't have nearly enough time to cover all of those from an exhaustive standpoint, right? Yeah. So we're looking at maybe some of the basics, some of the top 10 things, just making sure that we touch those and see what there is there that might be at risk. But I've seen a number of times where we've done an internal pen test and there's been a web application that like allows file upload, like just arbitrary file upload. We can get RC on the web server and things like that all the time. So web applications are a big risk for sure. And especially when you consider the fact that these web applications now have SSO, they're seemingly all connected. And once you get to one application, you might be able to pivot and get access to other applications.
Yeah.
So very big attack surface.
One of the biggest problems that I have in just in the way that web application security is approached, right? And I know we're kind of deviating a little bit, but we'll talk about some of the other topics as well. But is people, do not have the same level of scrutiny on internal web apps as they do external web apps, right? And we've said this many times on the show here. The internal network is no longer part of this like bastion of security that it used to be in the early 2000s, where it's like, oh, well, if you're inside the firewall, then you can get to anything, right? And we still have that mentality with web apps.
Yep.
And, the problem with that is obviously what you've described, and so I think the adage here, and I'm going to steal buzzwords from somebody, but, identity is the new perimeter, is absolutely true. And so, these web apps and a lot of times what we find, and this is in the healthcare industry and the financial industry as well, these apps will be designed for internal use only. And then due to scope creep and the need for exposing this, like COVID did this to a lot of web apps, right? It was internal only, and then there was no internal network anymore. So now we have to expose this thing to the public internet, which it was never designed for, and it has all these insane flaws. So, we're still seeing that stuff today. In fact, we just did a web app pen test for a client of ours on 2 web apps of theirs, and it was just like, guys, these vulnerabilities were from like 1999,
Yeah, and something I saw related to financial services was you have, your policy system, right, that quotes insurance or that writes those policies and kind of gives estimates and does all the risk adjusting and like all that stuff, part of the core policy system. Mm-hmm. Well, you have a lot of integrations, right, that might reach out to different APIs to see like how close they are to a fire department, how close they are to water body or bodies of water. If they're in floodplains or flood zones, like there's a lot of these integrations that they have to pull in different information. And a lot of those have, broken authentication or either just wide open or whatever the case may be. And there's a lot of flaws with those as well because of all the integrations.
Yeah.
It can be hard to manage all those, especially for an IT admin or somebody who, think of a small financial services firm, right? Like, or a small medium size, like, they might not necessarily have like a whole team of developers to manage those integrations.
Right.
They're kind of relying on a third party. They're relying on some of their experience and skill set to kind of manage those and maintain those. So that also is a risk that I see that's very unique to financial services, is all those different integrations for those banking systems, quoting systems, insurance systems, et cetera.
So I'll take it even further, right? One of the core tenets of the financial services industry that makes it unique is you are literally giving access to random people into your system. right? Whether you're an insurance company and people need to log into it to access whatever, claims or whatever it may be, get insurance quotes. So you have to uniquely identify these random people and allow them access into your system. And so that requires a pretty good password policy. That should require MFA. So you kind of have to protect these people from themselves. It's the
Yep.
same thing with mortgage origination and online banking, right? Those were our two biggest challenges. Is like, think about mortgage origination and insurance quoting, because they're effectively the same thing. You're going to allow a random person that does not have an account on your system to come log into your system, create an account, fill out all of the sensitive PII, PHI, whatever it is, right? And then send that back into your system. They're going to have to recall that later. And so they're uploading files. They are, filling out free form fields, which we love to see those in web apps, right? And so, and they're going to be stored in a data set that is shared amongst all of your client base. That is horrifying when you put it in that context. And so your security controls in these web apps have to be absolutely on point. And in most cases, they're just not, man. And it only takes one, flaw to expose all of that information, just like in that pen test I talked about with GraphQL,
Yep.
man. So yeah, there are some unique challenges there. And we have to be on our top game when we're building these web apps. And unfortunately, most vendors are just not, you know.
Yeah. So the next one is credential theft / session hijacking.
Mm-hmm.
This one, as the garbage truck goes by, I don't know if everybody could hear that.
Barely perceptible.
Yeah. So credential theft, session hijacking. This is like your Microsoft 365, like man in the middle attack, right? Where user goes and they think they're logging in. That authentication session and token is passed on to attacker, and then the user's logged in and everything is fine and dandy. So those are becoming much more popular nowadays, and very recently, especially given the fact that, like we said, so many of our applications now are all SSO'd. I think I read a study this morning. It was like a white paper that had some stats in it, and it was like the average organization has 85 SSO apps. 85. So we're talking like Zoom and OneDrive and MailChimp and Asana and Confluence and all of these things are all SSO'd now. And many times if authentication and access isn't set up correctly, if users are overprivileged, they will, once they log into Microsoft, they're logged into everything.
Yeah.
It's just like you have access to everything you want. So these credential theft, session hijacking attacks are becoming a big problem because of this overprivileged, overpermissioned kind of environment that the cloud is now, and the proliferation, if you will, of all of these SSO applications. We went from, it's kind of funny, we went from one problem to the other. Like from on-prem to cloud, somebody asked me, like, is cloud more secure, or isn't cloud more secure? And it's like, well, it's just a different problem, right? There's pros and cons to both. It's a different problem. So credential theft, session hijacking, there are toolkits. It's very, fairly straightforward to abuse and exploit this from an attacker perspective. And the signals for it are not as good yet. Like the detections for this are not as good yet as they are for other things like, dumping credentials on an endpoint. So really something of concern for all organizations, especially financial services. Dude,
I will tell you, by comparison to, let's say, internal pen testing or more traditional network-based pen testing, the trouble that I have with all these web apps and all this SSO and tying all these to a single set of credentials is that we still don't have good visibility into application behavior. And what I mean by that is I can do all sorts of nasty stuff once I'm SSO'd into an app, and there is no telemetry, right? Nobody's monitoring these logs. I can think of maybe 5 instances in my entire career, which has been long and storied, where I've actually been caught on a web app pit test, right? Or I've been caught, by compromising a user session specifically, because that session is explicitly trusted by that application, and it's so easy to farm sessions. I don't think most people realize how easy that really is, because it is, right? And so we should actually do an entire podcast episode on how that works and
Yep.
what protections can be in place for it. But literally just had that conversation yesterday with a client's vendor where we were able to inject scripting into the login banner that pops up after you authenticate. And we just injected JavaScript into it that would ship the session over to our server. So every single time somebody logged in, we got a copy of their session.
Yep.
I don't even need their creds at that point, dude.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, and that's what's so dangerous about these session theft hijacks, right? Is like they're post authentication, which
Right.
means MFA isn't a
Doesn't matter
concern.
anymore, bro.
MFA isn't a factor in that situation, right?
Yeah.
So the saving graces are things like conditional access.
Yeah.
Conditional access is a drum that we beat all the time. It's something we don't see configured nearly enough.
Right.
Or if it is, it's kind of like misconfigured or it's overly permissive. It has the same problems as like group policy did on-prem, right? Like same problems, just different kind of UI, different kind of environment. But that's why that's one of the reasons why that's so deadly and so dangerous. But like I said, the conditional access, having conditional access for token binding, which I think is a new feature in Microsoft.
Yep.
To help restrict who can log in with those tokens. And then conditional access and requiring device compliance, right? You can only log in from a compliant device. Those kinds of things can really help mitigate these attacks. But to your point, like the detection of that is still very nascent, like it's still very up and coming. One of the detections that people commonly see is authentications over VPN. That's a dead giveaway. That's a big red flag.
Yeah.
And then the other one is these rogue apps or these unauthorized applications. So if you're able to baseline like your applications in your environment, then you should know like, oh, somebody's logging in with this strange Microsoft app that we don't normally log into ever.
Yeah.
That's a common technique for threat actors. Is like they won't just log into Microsoft.com. They're going to log in using like the PowerShell app or the SharePoint app, or like there's different applications you can authenticate to in Microsoft Cloud and 365. So some signals on that I've seen detections for that can help identify some of those things.
But they're not widespread, right? Most people are not using those. And it's also something that's worthy of discussion, like you just mentioned, is the number of authentication endpoints that exist in a Microsoft ecosystem, right, in the cloud. In fact, we have just recently pivoted to some new tooling that allows us to basically credential spray across like 10 different endpoints. So we're no longer spraying a singular endpoint in SharePoint, for example, which we actually used to do a lot of. But now we're hitting Teams, we're hitting Microsoft Graph API, and here's the thing: a lot of people don't realize many of these endpoints are not using MFA by default. So you may have policies in your Microsoft ecosystem that enforces MFA, but unless it's enforcing it on all endpoints, it might as well be enforcing it on none. Because once I have that session, I can go anywhere I want, and the MFA doesn't matter anymore. And so that's one of the reasons that we have been having these hard conversations with a lot of clients. And you were there for one of them, the one that we did a while back that was like a really big deal. That those guys were like, yeah, but we have MFA. I'm like, bro, MFA is not what it used to be, man. Like, it's good, don't get me wrong, but everything else is garbage in your environment, and so as a result of that, your MFA means a lot less. And so it's just difficult, I think, for banks and all of the different types of institutions in this vertical to keep track of all of it, right? Especially smaller organizations that don't have expertise in cloud. At that point, you're literally just relying on hoping Microsoft does it right out of the gate, which we all know they don't. And so it's tough, man. It's tough.
Yeah. And, it's compounded by the fact that by Shadow IT, which is now, I guess, Shadow SaaS, right? Previously, people would, buy applications without the help of IT, right? Hence Shadow IT. Now you can just log into an application using your Microsoft account and authenticate that account and allow it to read your email or make LinkedIn posts on your behalf or whatever your account is set up to do, right? Your Microsoft account, read your OneDrive files or, check your SharePoint sites and things like that. We now give these applications access and grant access to all of these things that have downstream impacts without really understanding the risks of it. And to your point, by default, users just can just consent to applications for themselves, right? They can't consent on behalf of the whole organization, but by default, they can consent to applications for their own account.
Yes.
So a user,
one of the first things we recommend people turn off.
Yeah. A user could just consent to like some, suspicious application to read all their email, for example.
Well, that's one of the most dangerous things that I think Microsoft has done is enabling SharePoint and OneDrive by default, meaning that your users are saving files, unbeknownst to you probably, into their OneDrive environment. Users are, creating entries in SharePoint without any interaction from IT, without any permission, anything like that. And so, like, for example, when you share a file in Teams, it is immediately stored in SharePoint. That is actually the central point of access in use by most file storage in an M365 tenant. And the level of protection around that may not be what you think it is. And so there's a lot of this stuff happening behind the scenes. And I think this is where cloud goes sideways for on-prem stuff.
Yep.
And that is that all of these moving parts exist behind the scenes. Some of them you've probably never heard of. And they're creating a larger attack surface for your organization, and they are not being secured by default. And so it is a scary thing, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of traffic now from clients who are saying, hey, come look at our cloud. Tell us what's going on in here. Tell us if it's secure. And so, if you're not doing that, man, you're just hoping for the best, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that a strategy for security? I mean,
and most of the time, or a lot of times, these attacks kind of present themselves, or they don't present themselves until something like wire fraud happens, or BEC, which is the next thing we want to talk about, is or Outlook rule gets created, right, to forward emails or to delete emails to cover their tracks, kind of thing, or to forward emails on to their external mailbox. So a lot of times these attacks don't get caught until there is a third party that says, hey, we got this request for a wire transfer for $4 million. We sent it, but is this legit? It's like,
that'll make your heart drop.
That happens all the time.
It does. It really does, man. So let's talk about BEC then, right? I think the audience probably knows more or less what BEC is, but if you want to just high level nickel tour that, and then we can talk about
BEC, business email compromise, is usually the name referred to for essentially social engineering people out of money, and it's usually what people talk about in the context of BEC is somebody compromises a mailbox or an email account and tricks a third party into wiring money that they shouldn't wire, right? For example, if you're like a realtor, or you're an insurance, or a banking institution, right? If I can compromise a mailbox and look at the last emails, or compromise somebody in particular that has to do with the financial transaction processing, processes at the organization, like accounts payable, or somebody in finance, and cherry pick their emails, so reply to an email chain where they're already talking about wire transfers and things like that, and then send them an updated wire transfer document, right? That just with a new account number. That's what these BEC attacks are. They're financially motivated, social engineering attacks where somebody's going to compromise a mailbox or try and social engineer a user to send money to an attacker controlled account, for example.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And this has, I think at one point had overtaken ransomware as one of the most common methods of
I think it still does, from the IC3 report. I think it still overshadows ransomware just from a purely reporting standpoint. It seems like BEC is just reported more, or more, it's more reportable, if that's a word. Whereas ransomware is probably drastically more in terms of effect, I would say.
Impact would be higher.
A lot of it's intangible, is like not reported, or it's hard to put a number on those things.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, BEC is easier, man. Literally, like you just need access to one email account. And that email account, the identity associated with that account is implicitly trusted by all parties, right? And we've seen that take the form of instant messaging now, that, almost every organization, on earth is using some form of Teams or Slack or
Yep.
whatever it is. And so, that has been brought into the fold with regards to BEC as well. And really we've even seen, third party vendors compromise downstream clients because of similar type things, right? So basically, what we've had to do, and we'll talk about defense as well, but you just can't trust email anymore, right? You
Yep.
just can't, because now you need to pick up the phone and call, like, hey, you really want to change the account number on this wire transfer? Because we've been using the same account number for 15 years,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, that's one of the big things. And it's something I think I wrote a blog post. It's on the Security 360 website somewhere about like how to defend against BEC attacks. So if you're interested in reading that, it's a how-to of like how to mitigate those things. If you're
Yeah, we
curious
can throw that in the show notes if you want.
Yeah. But one of the mitigating factors is exactly that. It's like out of band verification.
Yeah.
Right. If somebody sends you a request for a wire transfer or a funds transfer, something financially related, you have to verify it out of band, which means you don't just say reply okay and then send the wire. Right. You have to call the person, or you have to speak to them in person, ideally. But in distributed world, obviously that's not always possible. So verifying out of band is one of the best things you can do to prevent that or to mitigate that. And then just teaching users teaching your users and your team what the approved processes are. Like if there does need to be a change made, what is the approved process to go about doing that? Do we just send an email to Susie and say, hey, can you change this? Or is there some sort of verification that has to happen, right? Ideally, there is some sort of verification. So when you get a request that falls out of that process, you should immediately be suspicious and be like, well, that's not our approved process for handling this. Whether it's somebody calling or sending an email or whatever the case may be, having a documented process and everybody understanding and knowing that helps kind of identify when there might be some suspicious stuff happening, because that's something that we see in voice phishing all the time.
That's what I was about to say. Yep.
There's a documented process. We did an engagement recently. There was a well-documented process. The help desk analyst in this case followed the process somewhat, but then kind of like failed to kind of fully verify the person and kind of fully go through the process in depth. And there were some other factors involved there, but having a process, going through it and making sure users kind of stick to that process is really important for mitigating these BEC attacks.
Yeah, man, this isn't new, right? What we're talking about is decades old.
Yeah.
And that is like, we don't trust anything without some sort of, to your point, we call it trusted channel, right? A known good channel. So if I'm, and to the point of the voice pretext phishing, right? Like if I call the help desk at your organization and say, hey, I'm the CEO, I need to reset my password. You're not just going to do that, right? Well, I mean, you might, based on the evidence that we have from the engagements.
Yeah.
But the point is, you're not supposed to, right? And everybody understands that. This isn't like some breakthrough thing. So if we are going to have processes in place to protect against like account takeovers through IT support, why wouldn't we have the same level of protection wrapped around things like financial transactions or major substantial changes to process involving financial aspects to the business? And so it still blows my mind that we're doing business over email, like strictly with regards to this stuff. And so we as defenders, right, we need to be thinking like a bad guy thinks. I'm looking at this process, how could I take advantage of this if I were a criminal, and then put protections in place? It's really that simple, right? So we have to be thinking about what the bad guys are doing. And what's amazing is none of this stuff's new, dude.
Yep.
Most of the things that are in this report are like groundbreaking new technology, new thing. They're just the same old things still being done, just in different facets of the organization. And so we have to step up our game a little bit with regards to that.
Yeah, definitely, and especially as it comes to ransomware. We haven't said blocking and tackling in a while, but like it's the mitigations are blocking and tackling. It's foundational stuff. But ransomware is particularly attractive kind of end goal for threat actors because of the data, like we talked about in the last episode. We talked a lot about the data and the reasons why financial services organizations are under heavy attack. But having data, having PII, particularly data that people can sell, right? Data that's valuable, that somebody would pay for to continue their attack or to carry out whatever attack they want, is very attractive to threat actors. So you have a consolidated, lake of data. Ransomware is going to naturally
find its
suit.
way, man. Yeah, exactly.
And one of the things too is maybe they get access to the data, maybe they don't, but the extortion aspects of it, like if you have a confirmed threat actor in your environment, you've responded to an incident, maybe you don't necessarily know what data they had access to, if at all, right? There's the extortion aspects of it as well, that maybe they don't even need to steal the data. They just need to get in and kind of show that they've done some damage or they've stolen some data, and they can extort it, kind of double dip on the ransomware as well. So ransomware is also kind of like a big deal for all organizations, rightfully so.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. All right, so quick admin for those of you that are still listening. We really appreciate you guys. Our listenership has skyrocketed over the last couple of months, and we really just appreciate you guys. So feel free to share this podcast with your friends, your peers, and obviously, if you guys are in need of pen testing or other types of cyber services, feel free to reach out to us, man. That's what we do during I guess we call it our day job. I don't know how to describe that differently. Yep. Podcasting is our night job, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, so we love putting this information out there, and we do it absolutely for free to anybody that wants to listen, because we're really passionate about it, and we carry that passion into our work. So yeah, feel free to like, rate, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really helps us out a lot, and kind of motivates us to keep going and keep doing this, and so we really enjoy it. All right, common attack paths, right? So we're already at 31 minutes, and so I feel like we haven't even gotten to the bulk of the material. We always do this, but it's fine.
Yeah, there's just a couple things that I think would make sense to point out that we could just talk about that maybe we haven't talked about a ton before on other episodes. Yeah. We can kind of breeze through. But so common attack paths, when I think of the internal pen tests that I've done, the web app pen tests that we've done, cloud assessments, things like that, I think there's a handful of common things that normally bite organizations, financial services organizations included. So if I were an IT admin, or if I was a IT director, security director, somebody like that at a financial services firm, these are the 4 things that I would pay attention to. Not the only 4 things, but these are 4 things that I think can really hurt, that are maybe not talked about as much as maybe they should. Maybe the phishing and lack of MFA is, but some of these other ones I don't think. So unpatched internet-facing systems. We touched on this during the beginning of the episode with the web app attacks and kind of web app intrusions and system intrusions and things like that. So we don't necessarily beat a dead horse. But to me, this is a lot of times we see systems that people didn't know they have. So the takeaway for me is just asset inventory, good understanding. Yeah, blocking and tackling, good understanding of your environment, right? Of what's out there and what you need to protect.
Yeah, I think for me it's a combination, right? And we're really fortunate to have good leadership at the last bank that I worked at, and we actually had a patching process dedicated to public facing systems. And so we were actually ranking priority of patching based on a number of different parameters. And so, is it actively being exploited? Is there a proof of concept available? But also, is it internet facing? And so I've actually worked with some of our clients to address this issue. And it's really obviously know what you have. Literal step 1 in cybersecurity isn't even a cybersecurity thing. It's an IT function of knowing what systems you have and what their state is, what they're used for, and where they are.
Yep.
But the next big step, for me at least, is going to be prioritizing systems based on some kind of tiering or rating that identifies systems that are more at risk, right? More at risk in insurance and financial institutions, right? We're talking about online banking systems, remote access systems, because if I recall correctly, one of the recent statistics that has come out is that SSL VPNs are being absolutely hammered right now by the bad guys. And so Yeah, dude, you got to know what you got and you got to patch it. So we see this all the time, especially on external pen tests, which makes sense. It is, they might be, 3 or 4 versions behind on their SSL VPN. And as a result, there are some glaring flaws there. So yeah, man, if your stuff is public facing, one, minimize the attack surface of that as much as possible. So we just had this conversation with somebody the other day. It was like, hey, you've got like SSH and Telnet and some of these other antiquated services listening on this device, and it's probably not even required. So why don't we geofence that? Why don't we IP, blacklist everything, or whitelist, I guess, the systems that need access to that. But we want to minimize that footprint just a little bit, right, as much as we can. So if it doesn't need to be accessible to North Korea, maybe we don't let it be accessible to North Korea, right? Or if
Exactly.
you have some specific business use cases, and we do have one client who actually utilizes um, SFTP for legitimate business purposes. And we went through with them and we're like, all right, we're going to lock this thing down. We're going to ship logs and we're going to whitelist IPs.
Yep.
And so now any, Joe in the world can't gain access to those services. And so you really have to treat them differently. You have to treat these internet facing systems as the high risk devices that they are.
Mm.
And we're just not seeing that yet. I think
Yep.
it's not as widespread as I would want it to be. But that's something people should take into consideration.
Yep. The last one that I'll mention is internal AD and ADCS misconfigs.
What a surprise that you would bring that up, Spencer.
What a surprise! I mean, that's what I do every day, all day long.
Literally every day, man.
But particularly Active Directory certificate services, we see misconfigurations in about probably 9 out of 10 internal pen tests.
I agree.
We see AD misconfig or ADCS misconfigs. And these are anywhere from like 2-click domain admin type of misconfigs to misconfigs that are not as critical. They're just more of a hygiene kind of thing. Yeah. So this is something that is very easy to abuse from an attacker perspective. Literally all you need is access to the environment. And sometimes you don't even need a domain account to exploit some of these, depending on the configuration.
Yeah.
But with a domain account and access to the environment, many of these allow for direct privilege escalation to domain admin. And on the downside, the detections of these also are very nascent. Like they're still not very robust in terms of detections for this.
Yeah.
There are some tools that I'm starting to see some of the detections for this, some of the identity products, but not very comprehensively and not very reliably, I will say.
Yeah. I think Tyler got busted with Paincastle this morning on an internal. I saw the emails and I was like, you got caught, bro.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they're getting better for sure. Which is great. And it's great to see. The mitigation, I will say, and it's something I've said all the time, is tools like Locksmith for auditing Active Directory certificate services are amazing. Mm-hmm. You can run it. You get a report. It tells you exactly what you need to fix, how you need to fix it, the reason you need to fix it. It's a free tool, and it's something that I recommend organizations run at least, twice a year, maybe quarterly, something like that, depending on how often your, ADCS environment is changing. But that's something that is a very big deal. It's very easy to exploit. And most of the time, it's pretty low-hanging fruit to fix. It's like old certificates that are left out there, or they've just been misconfigured, or they have misconfigured permissions. And many times, those are pretty easy and straightforward to fix. And it can be a really good, quick win from a security standpoint.
So you've said something in the past that really stuck with me, and it was that Active Directory is not a security product, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think a lot of people realize that because, you couldn't blame someone for thinking that it is, right, due to the nature of the services that it provides. But at the end of the day, it is not designed to, air quotes, be secure. In fact, it is designed to, be an identity provider and it's a directory system.
Yep.
And it's not a security system, even though it might provide some of those functions. And so I think just the nature of Active Directory as it exists by default is relatively insecure, I would think, right? Is that a fair statement? And then the longer that system remains in your environment, the more changes that are made over time, the more of these artifacts that are out there that create security risks in that organization. So the point being, Active Directory takes a ton of care and feeding. and you have to be careful about what you do. I mean, one of the things that we used to run into all the time is when you would install a new service in your environment that requires Active Directory integration, you'd have to do it with a domain admin, and then that service or that application would then make changes in your environment, in
Mhm.
most cases without telling you what it did. And so, like, we would find like random Citrix certificates in our environment or random service accounts that we didn't create that were created as part of an installation process. So
Yep.
it's really, really easy to create a path to DA without intending to do so. And
Yep.
so that's what the purpose of what you're describing. These tools like Purple Knight, Ping Castle, are can go out there and look in that environment and identify those misconfigurations, to help you improve that. So, and the other thing you can do is get Spencer to do an internal pen test, right? Like that's really the best way to understand the legitimate attack paths. And I'm not even like trying to sell anything. It's literally like get a pen tester who understands Active Directory
Yep.
to the level that somebody like Spencer does, right? And that is going to get you a long way there. But that's a point in time. You still have to do your own work. This
Yep.
is not just a, oh well, yeah, no, Spencer looked at it, we're good for 3 years. This is an ongoing process, man.
Yep. Yeah, and the last thing I'll say about AD is you're absolutely right. It's an administrative tool, not a security tool.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's difficult about Active Directory is there can be a lot of tribal knowledge that gets lost when people move on, and they're the ones that managed Active Directory, set up the security group, set up group policy, because as we know, the documentation for those systems and those resources is not as good as it should be, right? So, Martin, the IT admin, or Joe, or whoever it was in your environment, right, at your organization, set it all up. Like it's from 2003 or it's a 2008 Forest, and like they just set it up, and you have now inherited it 20 years or 10 years or whatever the case may be. You've inherited all this stuff.
Yep.
And unless you go through every security group and every group policy and every permission, you don't really know what's out there unless you know what to look for and you know where to look. And that's the big, secret with Active Directory, I guess, is you got to know what to look for and you got to know where to look. And you have to go and look. You have to actually go and look for these things to be confident in the environment, and then hopefully document those things so that your future self will thank you later on.
Absolutely. And we talked about that a little bit in episode 1 of this series, and talking about the loss of institutional and tribal knowledge. And, it's a real thing. It's going to continue to exist. To your point, it's going to be up to management to enforce, hey, we need documentation on this, or, it's going to be up to your senior engineers to make sure this stuff is understood and documented well, so that when that knowledge does leave, at least some semblance of understanding is present. So yeah, no, I completely agree with that, man. All right, closing thoughts before we wrap. And I think this has been a really good kind of high level overview. I'd be interested in hearing feedback from those of you that are working in these markets, right, in the financial services arenas, and get your thoughts on these topics. If you're on YouTube, you can leave comments or you can shoot us an email. It should be in the show notes. So love to hear from you guys. If we miss something, critique is often as beneficial as praise. So would love to hear. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening and or watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your folks and reach out to us. We're at offsec.blog or securit360.com, and we'll see you next week.